Picture this. You're standing in your childhood driveway, holding a crumpled invitation that your own family just told you to throw away. Your cousin's wedding reception is happening 50 feet behind you, and you can hear the laughter and music that you're no longer welcome to join. But in exactly 5 minutes, the most powerful helicopter in America is going to land on that perfectly manicured lawn, and everything your family thought they knew about you is about to change forever. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sophia, and until 3 months ago, I was what you'd call the family disappointment. 28 years old, bouncing between temporary jobs, living in a studio apartment that my relatives loved to whisper about during holiday gatherings. The kind of person who shows up to family events in a dress from Target while everyone else is wearing designer labels. The Chen family has always been about appearances. My Uncle Richard owns 3 car dealerships across Northern California. My Aunt Patricia runs a successful real estate empire in Marin County. My cousins all went to prestigious universities and married into other successful families. And then there's me, Sophia Chen, the one who dropped out of business school to pursue photography, much to everyone's horror. For years, I'd been the subject of their concerned conversations. What's Sophia going to do with her life? They'd ask, as if I wasn't standing right there. She needs to get serious about her future. They meant well, I suppose, but their version of caring felt more like judgment wrapped in family obligation. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday in April. My cousin Jennifer was marrying some tech executive from Silicon Valley, and it was going to be the social event of the year for our family. 300 guests, a venue overlooking the San Francisco Bay, and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. The invitation was beautiful, thick cardstock with gold embossing that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But there was something different about this invitation. Usually, family invitations came with handwritten notes from my Aunt Patricia, little messages like, "Looking forward to seeing you there, dear," or "Hope you can make it work with your schedule." This one was just formal, printed text. No personal touch, no warm family sentiment. I should have seen it as a warning sign. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with family group chats that I was mysteriously left out of. Conversations would stop when I walked into rooms during family visits. My cousin Michael, who I'd always been close with, seemed oddly distant when I ran into him at the grocery store. "Everything okay?" I asked him that day, standing in the cereal aisle like we were discussing state secrets. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Just busy with wedding stuff, you know." I didn't know, because apparently I wasn't included in the wedding stuff. The day of the reception arrived with that perfect California weather that makes you understand why people pay $3 million for a house with a decent view. Jennifer had chosen the Blackwood Estate in Hillsborough, one of those sprawling properties that old tech money built in the 90s. The main house looked like something from a European fairy tale, complete with turrets and ivy-covered walls. I'd spent more than I could afford on a navy blue dress and actually got my hair done at a salon for the first time in 2 years. I wanted to look like I belonged, even though deep down I knew I never really had. The ceremony was beautiful. Jennifer looked radiant in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. The groom, David, seemed genuinely happy, which was all that really mattered. I sat in the back with some distant relatives I barely knew, watching my family celebrate in their perfectly coordinated outfits and practiced smiles. But it was during the cocktail hour that things started to go wrong. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne that cost more than my usual bottle of wine, when I overheard my Aunt Patricia talking to Jennifer's new mother-in-law. "Oh, that's our Sophia," Patricia was saying, and her tone made it clear this wasn't going to be a compliment. "She's still trying to figure things out. We're hoping this whole photography phase is temporary." Photography phase. As if 3 years of building my business from nothing was just some quarter-life crisis that would eventually pass. The mother-in-law, a woman whose jewelry could have funded a small country, glanced over at me with the kind of look reserved for interesting zoo animals. "How artistic," she said in a tone that made artistic sound like a communicable disease. I moved away from them, trying to shake off the familiar sting of family embarrassment. This was Jennifer's day, I reminded myself. I could endure a few hours of subtle condescension for my cousin's happiness. The reception moved into the main ballroom, a space that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought Versailles was too understated. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling, painted with cherubs and clouds. The tables were set with china that I was afraid to touch and flower arrangements that were taller than most people. I found my assigned seat at table 12, which was apparently where they put the family members they had to invite, but didn't particularly want to showcase. My table mates included my great-uncle Harold, who spent most social gatherings discussing his various medical procedures in graphic detail, and Jennifer's college roommate who nobody really liked but who had to be invited for political reasons. Dinner was served with the kind of precision you'd expect from a military operation. Each course was more elaborate than the last, presented by servers who moved through the room like well-trained dancers. I tried to focus on the food, which was admittedly incredible, and ignore the fact that I felt like an outsider at my own family's celebration. But then came the speeches. Uncle Richard stood up first, champagne glass in hand, and began what could only be described as a business presentation disguised as a toast. He talked about Jennifer's accomplishments, her successful career in marketing, her excellent choice in a husband who came from good family stock. Then he started talking about family values, about how proud he was of the younger generation and their commitment to excellence, how Jennifer represented everything the Chen family stood for: success, ambition, and the pursuit of the American dream. As he spoke, his eyes swept across the room, landing on various family members with obvious pride. When his gaze reached table 12, it slid right past me like I was invisible. Other family members gave speeches. Jennifer's brother talked about growing up with such an ambitious sister. David's best man made jokes about how he'd never seen someone so driven to succeed. Even my cousin Michael got up and talked about family legacy and living up to expectations. Every speech felt like a subtle reminder that I didn't measure up, that I wasn't the kind of Chen they wanted to celebrate. I was starting to consider making a quiet exit when Uncle Richard approached my table during a lull in the evening's festivities. He pulled out the chair next to mine and sat down with the kind of deliberate casualness that immediately put me on alert. "Sophia," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone adults use when they're about to give you life advice you didn't ask for, "we need to talk." Quote. The conversation that followed was one of those family moments that gets burned into your memory with uncomfortable clarity. Richard explained in his carefully measured way that the family was concerned about me, about my choices, my direction, my apparent lack of ambition. "You're 28, he said, as if I'd somehow forgotten. "Most people your age have established careers, stable relationships, and clear goals. We're worried that you're wasting your potential." He talked about family reputation, about how my struggles reflected on all of them, about how Jennifer's new in-laws were successful people who moved in influential circles, and how important it was to make the right impression. The subtext was clear. I was an embarrassment they could no longer afford to publicly acknowledge. "We think it would be best," Richard continued, "if you left early tonight, before the real celebration begins. Some of David's family are flying in from Washington, very important people, and we want to make sure the evening goes smoothly." I stared at him, processing what he was actually saying. My own family was asking me to leave my cousin's wedding reception because they were ashamed of me. "You want me to leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We think it's for the best," Patricia said, appearing beside Richard like she'd been waiting in the wings for her cue. "Just for tonight. We can all sit down and talk about your future at a better time." The rest of the conversation was a blur of polite euphemisms and family politics. They weren't kicking me out, they explained. They were just suggesting that I might be more comfortable elsewhere. They weren't ashamed of me, they were just being considerate of the other guests. They weren't giving up on me, they just needed me to be somewhere else while they celebrated everything I wasn't. I found myself standing in the circular driveway 20 minutes later, still holding my purse and the small gift I'd brought for Jennifer. The invitation was crumpled in my other hand, not because I'd done it intentionally, but because my hands were shaking, and I'd apparently been gripping it too tightly. Behind me, the party continued. I could hear the band starting up again, the sound of laughter and celebration drifting across the perfectly manicured grounds. Ahead of me was my 10-year-old Honda Civic, parked between two Teslas like a visual representation of my place in the family hierarchy. I stood there for a moment, looking back at the house where my family was celebrating without me, wondering how exactly my life had led to this moment. 3 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing in this driveway, effectively banished from my own cousin's wedding, I would have laughed. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. But 3 months ago, I had no idea that everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. I was reaching for my car keys when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the suburban quiet of Hillsborough's most exclusive neighborhood. It was distant at first, like thunder on a clear day, but growing louder with each passing second. The unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the evening air. The helicopter sound grew louder, and suddenly everyone at the reception could hear it. Through the tall windows of the ballroom, I could see guests turning their heads toward the sky, champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. The band had stopped playing mid-song. I looked up and saw it, a massive green and white helicopter descending toward the estate's front lawn. But this wasn't just any helicopter. Even from a distance, I could see the distinctive markings, the presidential seal gleaming under the estate's landscape lighting. Marine One, the president's helicopter. My heart started racing, but not for the reason you might think. 3 months ago, I signed a document that changed everything about my life. A non-disclosure agreement so thick it could have been used as a doorstop. The kind of paperwork that comes with background checks so thorough they probably knew what I had for breakfast in 3rd grade. The helicopter touched down on the Blackwood Estate's pristine lawn with the precision of a military operation, which, of course, it was. The rotors were still spinning when the door opened and a figure in a dark suit stepped out, followed by several Secret Service agents who immediately began scanning the area with the kind of professional alertness that makes you suddenly aware of every movement you make. But it was the third person to emerge from Marine One that made the entire reception go dead silent. President Harrison stepped onto the lawn like he owned it, which, in a way, he temporarily did. He was shorter than he appeared on television, but carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from literally being the most powerful person in the world. His eyes swept across the stunned faces pressed against the ballroom windows, then landed on me standing alone in the driveway. He smiled. Not his practiced political smile, but something warmer and more genuine, and started walking directly toward me. The next few seconds felt like they were happening in slow motion. Secret Service agents flanked him as he approached, their eyes constantly moving, assessing threats that probably included my great-uncle Harold's tendency to speak loudly about his opinions on government policy. "Sophia," President Harrison said when he reached me, extending his hand. "Sorry I'm late, traffic was murder." It was such a perfectly normal thing to say that I almost laughed, despite the fact that the President of the United States was making small talk with me while my entire family watched from behind glass like we were exhibits in the world's most expensive zoo. "Mr. President," I managed to say, shaking his hand and trying to remember the protocol briefings I'd received. "Thank you for coming." "Wouldn't miss it," he said, then glanced toward the ballroom where every single person was now pressed against the windows. "Though it looks like we might have caused a bit of a stir." That was putting it mildly. Through the glass, I could see my family's faces displaying expressions I'd never witnessed before. Uncle Richard looked like he was experiencing some kind of medical emergency. Aunt Patricia appeared to be frozen mid-gesture, her champagne glass tilted at an angle that defied physics. Jennifer, still in her wedding dress, had her hand pressed against the window like she was trying to confirm this was actually happening. "Should we go inside?" President Harrison asked. "I'd like to meet your family." What happened next was like watching a nature documentary about human behavior under extreme stress. As we approached the ballroom, the crowd of wedding guests parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear path to where my family stood clustered together near the head table. The president moved through the room with practiced ease, stopping to shake hands and exchange brief pleasantries with guests who looked like they were meeting a mythical creature. Jennifer's new in-laws, the same people who had looked at me earlier like I was a charity case, now seemed to be having difficulty forming complete sentences. But it was my family's reaction that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Uncle Richard, who 20 minutes earlier had asked me to leave because I was an embarrassment, now stood at attention like he was being reviewed by a commanding officer. His entire demeanor had shifted from a condescending relative to someone desperately trying to make a good impression. "Mr. President," he stammered when Harrison approached, This is such an incredible honor." "The honor is mine," President Harrison replied smoothly. "Sophia has told me so much about her family. You must be very proud of her work." I watched Uncle Richard's face go through several different expressions as he processed this statement. Proud of my work? 3 months ago, he'd referred to my photography as a hobby that needed to end. "Of course," Richard said, his voice climbing an octave. "We've always supported Sophia's endeavors." Aunt Patricia appeared beside him, looking like she was recalibrating her entire understanding of reality. "Mr. President, we had no idea that she had top secret," President Harrison said with a conspiratorial wink. "The nature of her work requires absolute discretion. I'm sure you understand." They didn't understand. How could they? 3 months ago, I'd been a struggling photographer taking headshots for aspiring actors and shooting small weddings on weekends. I was behind on rent, driving a car that made concerning noises, and seriously considering moving back in with my parents. Then I got a phone call that changed everything. It started with a client referral that seemed too good to be true. A private event, they said. Excellent pay, but I'd need to sign some paperwork first. The paperwork turned out to be a security clearance application that required me to list every address I'd lived at for the past 15 years and provide character references who could vouch for my trustworthiness. The background investigation took 6 weeks. FBI agents interviewed my landlord, my college professors, and probably my high school guidance counselor. They ran financial checks, examined my social media history, and conducted interviews with people I'd forgotten I knew. When it was over, I found myself sitting in a nondescript office building in downtown San Francisco, signing documents that legally prevented me from discussing anything about my new job with anyone, including my family. My new employer, the White House Communications Agency. My new job title, Official Presidential Photographer, West Coast Division. The work was unlike anything I'd ever done. Presidential visits to California, classified diplomatic meetings, private moments that would become historical records. I traveled on Air Force 2, stayed in hotels where Secret Service agents checked my room before I entered, and took photographs that would eventually end up in presidential libraries and history books. But the job came with rules. Strict ones. I couldn't tell anyone what I was doing. My family thought I was still taking wedding photos and struggling to make ends meet. When they asked about my sudden financial stability, I told them I'd picked up some corporate clients. When they wondered why I was traveling so much, I said I was expanding my business to other cities. The hardest part wasn't the secrecy itself. It was watching my family continue to treat me like a failure while I was living a life they couldn't have imagined. President Harrison continued working the room, but I could see him keeping an eye on me. This wasn't actually a social visit, though my family didn't need to know that. There was a legitimate reason for him to be in Northern California tonight. A classified meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. But when his advance team learned about Jennifer's wedding, he'd made an executive decision. "Your photographer has been invaluable to our administration," he was saying to Jennifer, who looked like she might faint. "We wanted to show our appreciation." Jennifer's new husband, David, the tech executive, who I'd barely spoken to all evening, suddenly materialized beside me. "Sophia," he said, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there during cocktail hour. "I had no idea you worked for the administration." "It's not something I talk about," I said, which was both completely true and massively understated. The president spent another 20 minutes at the reception, taking photos with the bride and groom, chatting with guests who would probably never wash the hands he'd shaken, and generally turning Jennifer's wedding into the kind of event that would be talked about in social circles for decades. But it was his conversation with my parents that I found most interesting to watch. My mother, who had spent years asking when I was going to get serious about my career, now hung on every word as President Harrison described my professionalism and skill. My father, who had suggested just last month that I consider going back to school for something more practical, nodded along as the leader of the free world praised my artistic eye and technical expertise. "You raised an exceptional daughter," President Harrison told them, "the kind of person who makes America proud." I could see my mother's eyes filling with tears, though whether they were from pride or regret, I couldn't tell. When it was time for him to leave, President Harrison approached me one more time. "Walk me out?" he asked, though it was more of a directive than a request. As we made our way back through the ballroom, now filled with guests who were frantically updating their social media accounts and probably texting everyone they'd ever met, I could feel my family's eyes following us. Outside, the Secret Service had maintained their perimeter around Marine One, and the helicopter crew was already preparing for departure. The president stopped just short of the aircraft and turned to me. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Surreal," I admitted. 3 hours ago, they asked me to leave because I was embarrassing the family. He nodded knowingly. Sometimes people need a new perspective to see what was always there. Your work speaks for itself, Sophia. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As Marine One lifted off into the night sky, I stood in the same driveway where I'd been holding my crumpled invitation just an hour earlier. But everything had changed. The ballroom doors opened behind me, and my family emerged into the night air, still looking stunned. Uncle Richard approached first, his earlier condescension replaced by something that looked suspiciously like reverence. "Sophia," he said, his voice completely different from the tone he'd used to dismiss me earlier. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd ever had with my family. We moved to a private sitting room in the Blackwood estate, away from the other wedding guests who were still buzzing about what they'd witnessed. Jennifer had graciously offered the space, though she kept glancing at me like I was a completely different person than the cousin she'd grown up with. Uncle Richard sat across from me, his hands folded in his lap like a student waiting to be called on by the teacher. The man who had spent years lecturing me about responsibility and direction now seemed genuinely nervous about what he was going to say. "We owe you an apology," he began, the words coming out stilted and uncomfortable. "A massive apology." Aunt Patricia nodded vigorously beside him. "We had no idea, Sophia. How could we have known?" It was a fair question, but it also missed the point entirely. They couldn't have known about my job with the White House because of the security clearance requirements. But that wasn't really what this was about. "You couldn't have known about my work," I said carefully, "but you could have known me." The silence that followed was heavy, with years of accumulated misunderstandings and judgment. My cousin Jennifer, still in her wedding dress but now sitting beside me instead of across from me, was the first to speak. "We never really asked, did we?" she said quietly. "About your photography, I mean. We just assumed it wasn't serious because it wasn't what we expected." She was right. For 3 years, I'd been building my business, developing my skills, and creating work that I was proud of. But family gatherings always focused on conventional markers of success. Salary figures, job titles, company names that impressed other people at cocktail parties. My mother, who had been unusually quiet since President Harrison left, finally found her voice. "When did this start? Government work?" 3 months ago, I said, "but I've been a professional photographer for 3 years. The White House position came because of the work I'd already been doing." "What kind of work?" my father asked. He seemed genuinely curious now, which was more interesting than he'd shown in my career since I'd dropped out of business school. For the first time in years, I found myself actually talking to my family about my photography, not defending it or justifying it, but sharing it. I told them about the wedding I'd shot in Napa where the couple had met during a disaster relief effort, and how I'd captured the story of their relationship through the details of their ceremony. I described the portrait series I'd done with elderly immigrants in Chinatown, documenting their stories of coming to America decades ago. I explained how photography had taught me to see details that other people missed, to anticipate moments before they happened, to find beauty and meaning in situations that might seem ordinary to everyone else. These were exactly the skills that had made me valuable to the White House Communications Agency. The FBI agent who interviewed me during my background check said something interesting, I continued. She told me that the best presidential photographers aren't just technically skilled, they understand people. They can read a room, anticipate what's going to happen next, and capture moments that tell a larger story. Quote, Uncle Richard leaned forward. "Is that why they chose you?" "Partly," I said, "but also because I'd spent years learning to work in high-pressure situations where I couldn't control the environment. Wedding photographers deal with unpredictable lighting, demanding clients, tight schedules, and the knowledge that you can't ask someone to repeat their first kiss or their father's toast. Those skills translate pretty well to documenting presidential events. As I talked, I could see my family processing this information in real time. The work they'd dismissed as a phase was actually sophisticated professional training for one of the most exclusive photography positions in the country. Jennifer's new mother-in-law, the woman who had looked at me with such disdain during cocktail hour, appeared in the doorway of the sitting room. She'd clearly been hovering nearby, waiting for an opportunity to insert herself into the conversation. "Sophia," she said, her voice now dripping with the kind of enthusiasm that wealthy people reserve for other wealthy people, "I hope you'll forgive my earlier comments. I had no idea you worked for the administration." This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The opportunity to watch people who had dismissed me completely change their tune based on information that had nothing to do with who I was as a person. "What would have been different if you had known?" I asked her. The question clearly caught her off guard. She stammered for a moment, trying to find an answer that didn't make her sound as shallow as we both knew she was. "Well, it's just that government service is so admirable," she finally managed. "My work hasn't changed," I pointed out. "I was still a professional photographer this morning when you decided I was too artistic for polite conversation." The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by my cousin Michael, who had been quiet throughout most of the evening's revelations. "You know what's really messed up about this?" he said, looking around the room. "Sophia just proved that she's probably the most successful person in our entire family, and we're all acting like we need the president's permission to be proud of her." He was right, and his words hit harder than anything else that had been said. The president's visit hadn't changed my worth or my accomplishments. It had just made them visible to people who had refused to see them before. "I don't need you to be proud of me now," I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "But I would have liked you to respect me before tonight." My mother reached over and took my hand. "We do respect you, sweetheart. We just didn't understand." "You didn't try to understand," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." The conversation continued for another hour, covering ground that probably should have been covered years earlier. My family asked questions about my work that they'd never bothered to ask before. They listened to my answers in a way they never had when they thought my career was just a temporary distraction from more serious pursuits. But the most interesting part of the evening came when Jennifer pulled me aside as the reception was winding down. "Can I ask you something?" she said, and I nodded. "Are you happy?" It was such a simple question, but it was the first time anyone in my family had asked it in years. They'd asked if I was making enough money, if I was being practical, if I had a plan for the future, but no one had asked if I was happy. "Yes," I said, and realized as I said it that it was completely true. I love what I do. Even before the White House job, I loved it. I'm good at it. And it matters to me. Jennifer smiled, and for the first time all evening, she looked like the cousin I'd grown up with, instead of the perfectly polished bride who'd been performing for her new in-laws. "I'm sorry we made you feel like that wasn't enough," she said. "I'm sorry I made you feel like that wasn't enough." As the evening finally came to an end, I found myself back in the same driveway where everything had started. But instead of standing alone with a crumpled invitation, I was surrounded by family members who were suddenly seeing me as someone worth knowing. Uncle Richard approached me one last time before I left. "Sophia," he said, "I know this doesn't make up for how we've treated you, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not because the president showed up tonight, but because you built something meaningful, despite us not supporting you." It was probably the closest thing to a genuine apology I was going to get from him, and surprisingly, it felt like enough. As I drove home that night, I thought about the conversation I'd had with President Harrison 3 months earlier, when he'd offered me the position. He'd asked me if I was ready for my life to change, and I'd assumed he meant the travel, the security clearances, and the high-profile assignments. I hadn't realized he also meant that success would force the people around me to confront their own assumptions about what my life was worth. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the drive home. Family members who had barely acknowledged my existence for years were suddenly reaching out, wanting to congratulate me, asking questions about my work, and generally treating me like someone whose opinions mattered. But the message that meant the most came from my younger cousin Sarah, who had always been quiet at family gatherings. I'm studying journalism at Berkeley, her text read. I've been afraid to tell the family because it's not practical enough. Watching you tonight gave me courage. Thank you for showing us that success looks different for everyone. That's when I realized the most important thing about the evening's events. President Harrison hadn't just vindicated my career choices. He'd accidentally taught my family a lesson about the cost of conditional love and support. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My quiet life as an undercover presidential photographer was about to get a lot more complicated. But for the first time in years, I felt like my family actually knew who I was. The media storm started at 6:47 a.m. the next morning. I woke up to my phone ringing incessantly, the screen lighting up with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. My first instinct was panic. Had I somehow violated my security clearance? Was this about classified information? Then I saw the news alert that changed everything. President makes surprise appearance at California wedding to honor White House photographer. Someone at the reception had posted a video to social media. In the shaky phone footage, you could clearly see President Harrison walking directly to me in the driveway, shaking my hand and calling me by name. Within 6 hours, the video had been shared over 50,000 times. My doorbell rang at 7:15. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in a business suit holding a microphone, with a camera crew behind her on my apartment building's front steps. Ms. Chen, she called through the door. I'm Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7 News. We'd love to speak with you about your work with the president. Quote, I backed away from the door like it was radioactive. This was exactly what the security briefings had warned me about. The whole point of my position was discretion. Presidential photographers were supposed to be invisible, documenting history without becoming part of the story themselves. My work phone, a secure device that I was required to carry at all times, buzzed with an encrypted message. Report to SF field office immediately. Bring a bag. The go bag was something every White House employee learned about during orientation. A packed suitcase ready for immediate travel, containing enough clothes and essentials for a week away from home. I'd never actually had to use mine before. Getting out of my apartment building without being seen by the news crew required the kind of strategic thinking usually reserved for covert operations. Fortunately, my building had a service entrance that connected to the parking garage. I made it to my car and onto the highway before the reporters realized I was gone. The San Francisco field office was located in a nondescript building in the financial district, the kind of place that looked like it housed insurance companies and accounting firms. I'd only been there twice before. Once for my initial security briefing, and once for an equipment pickup. Agent Collins, my primary contact with the Secret Service, was waiting for me in a conference room on the 15th floor. She was a woman in her 40s who carried herself with the kind of professional composure that made you understand why she'd been entrusted with protecting national security. How bad is it? I asked as I sat down across from her. It's complicated, she said, which the government said was worse than you think, but not catastrophic yet. She opened a tablet and showed me the social media explosion that had occurred overnight. The original video from the wedding had spawned hundreds of reaction posts, news articles, and speculation threads. People were trying to figure out who I was, how I'd gotten the job, and what kind of access I had to the president. The good news, Agent Collins continued, is that most of the coverage is positive. The president's approval ratings actually went up overnight because people liked seeing him take time to acknowledge the work of a regular American. And the bad news? 3 foreign intelligence services have already started running background checks on you. Your apartment building has been under surveillance since 5 a.m., and we've intercepted at least 6 attempts to hack your personal email accounts. I felt my stomach drop. This was exactly what I'd signed all those forms to prevent. There's more, she said. Your family members are also getting attention. Your Uncle Richard has already given 2 phone interviews to local news stations. That was somehow worse than the foreign intelligence services. At least they were professionals who understood discretion. Uncle Richard, on the other hand, had never met a conversation he couldn't turn into a business networking opportunity. Agent Collins pulled up a news clip on her tablet. There was Uncle Richard, standing in front of one of his car dealerships, talking to a reporter about how proud the family had always been of my, quote, government service. "We always knew Sophia was destined for great things," he was saying, with the kind of confidence that would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. "The Chen family has a long tradition of public service and excellence." I had to give him credit. He'd managed to rewrite 3 years of family history in less than 12 hours. "The White House communications director wants to speak with you," Agent Collins said, closing the tablet. "In about 10 minutes. The call came through on a secure video connection that made my laptop screen look like something from a science fiction movie. Director Patricia Henley appeared on the screen, calling from what looked like her office in the West Wing. Behind her, I could see the kind of controlled chaos that I'd learned to associate with high-level government operations. "Ms. Chen," she said without preamble, "you've become famous overnight. How do you feel about that?" It was a loaded question from someone who definitely already knew the answer. "Terrible," I said honestly. "This is exactly what I was trained not to let happen." Director Henley nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Now here's what we're going to do about it." The plan she outlined was more complex than anything I'd encountered during my 3 months on the job. The White House was going to use the media attention strategically, turning my accidental exposure into a controlled narrative about the professionalism and dedication of government employees. "You're going to do exactly 3 interviews," she explained. "One with a major network, one with a respected print publication, and one with a photography trade magazine. You'll stick to approved talking points about the honor of serving your country and the professionalism of the White House Communications Agency. You will not discuss specific events, locations, or personnel. And after that? After that, you disappear back into your regular duties, and hopefully the public moves on to the next story." It sounded reasonable in theory, but I'd worked in the media long enough to know that news cycles rarely followed anyone's preferred timeline. The first interview was scheduled for that evening with CNN. I spent the afternoon in media training with a communications specialist who taught me how to redirect questions, stay on message, and project confidence while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. "Remember," she told me during one of our practice sessions, "you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every government employee who does their job professionally and with discretion. Show them what public service looks like." The CNN interview took place at their San Francisco bureau, in a studio that was much smaller than it appeared on television. The host, James Morrison, was someone I'd watched for years but had never imagined I'd be sitting across from. "You've become an overnight sensation," he said as the cameras started rolling. "How does it feel to go from anonymous government employee to viral video star?" I gave the answer I'd rehearsed. "It's surreal, but I want to emphasize that I'm just one of thousands of dedicated professionals who work every day to serve the American people. The real story here isn't about me. It's about the incredible honor of documenting history as it happens." The interview lasted 20 minutes, covering my background, my path to government service, and my thoughts on the importance of professional photography in preserving historical moments. I managed to get through it without revealing anything classified or particularly personal. But it was the questions I couldn't answer that made the interview interesting. "Can you tell us about specific events you've photographed with the president?" "I'm not able to discuss specific assignments or locations for security reasons." "How often do you interact directly with the president?" "My job is to document events professionally and unobtrusively. The focus should always be on the historical significance of what's being recorded, not on the photographer." "What was it like growing up in a family that didn't understand your career ambitions?" That question caught me off guard because it wasn't in any of the prep materials I'd been given. "I think a lot of people can relate to feeling misunderstood by their families," I said carefully. "But what happened at my cousin's wedding shows that sometimes people just need a new perspective to see what was always there." After the interview, I drove back to my apartment to find that the news crews had multiplied. There were now vans from 3 different television stations parked on my street, and I could see photographers with long lenses positioned across from my building. Agent Collins called while I was sitting in my car trying to figure out how to get inside without being photographed. "Change of plans," she said. "You're not going home tonight. We're moving you to a secure location until this dies down." The secure location turned out to be a corporate apartment in downtown San Francisco that the government maintained for exactly these kinds of situations. It was nice enough, better than my actual apartment, but it felt like being in witness protection. As I sat in the unfamiliar living room that night, watching news coverage of my own life on television, I realized that everything had changed again. 3 months ago, my family didn't respect my career. Yesterday, they learned to see me differently. Today, I'd become a public figure representing something larger than myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Watching you on CNN right now. You're handling this amazingly. Also, our wedding is definitely going to be remembered forever now." That made me smile for the first time all day. At least something good had come out of this chaos. But as I prepared for the next day's interview with the Washington Post, I couldn't shake the feeling that my quiet life as an undercover presidential photographer was over permanently. The question now was what would replace it. The Washington Post interview happened 3 days later in a coffee shop that had been cleared of other customers for security reasons. The reporter Maria Santos was a veteran journalist who specialized in stories about government employees and public service. She had the kind of sharp intelligence that made me understand why the White House had approved her specifically. "Let's talk about the elephant in the room," she said after we'd covered the standard questions about my background and training. "Your family didn't know about your job. That must have created some difficult moments." "It did," I admitted, "but the security requirements were clear from the beginning. I couldn't discuss my work with anyone who didn't have proper clearance. Even when they were criticizing your career choices?" It was a perceptive question that cut straight to the heart of what had made the past 3 months so challenging. "Especially then," I said. "The hardest part wasn't keeping the secret. It was watching people I loved make assumptions about my life based on incomplete information." Maria leaned forward slightly. "Do you think your family would have treated you differently if they'd known from the beginning?" "I hope so," I said. "But I also think there's a bigger lesson here about how we value different types of work and success. My photography was always professional and meaningful, even before the White House position. The president's visit didn't change the quality of my work, it just made it visible to people who had refused to see it before." The interview ran for over an hour, covering everything from the technical aspects of presidential photography to the broader questions about public service and family expectations. Maria was skilled enough to make the conversation feel natural while still getting the quotes she needed for her story. But it was her final question that stayed with me long after the cameras stopped rolling. "What happens next for you? Your life has changed dramatically in just a few days." "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I'm learning that sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying to control how other people see you and focus on doing work that matters to you." The article came out 2 days later under the headline, "The Presidential Photographer Who Became Famous by Accident." It was a thoughtful piece that managed to tell my story without sensationalizing it or revealing anything that could compromise security. More importantly, it seemed to accomplish what the White House had hoped for. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, with people expressing admiration for government employees who did their jobs professionally despite personal costs. But the unexpected consequence was that other people started reaching out to share their own stories. My secure email account, which was supposed to be used only for official communications, started receiving messages from government employees across different agencies who had experienced similar family situations. A State Department translator whose parents thought she was just a secretary. A NASA engineer whose relatives kept asking when he was going to get a real job. A CIA analyst whose family assumed she worked in computers and never bothered to ask for details. The stories were remarkably similar. Dedicated professionals whose families had dismissed or misunderstood their work, often for years. People who had chosen service over conventional markers of success, only to find that the people closest to them couldn't see the value in what they were doing. Agent Collins showed me some of the messages during one of our regular check-ins. "This is interesting," she said, scrolling through the emails on her tablet. "Your story seems to have resonated with a lot of people who feel undervalued in their own families. What does that mean for my situation?" "It means the White House is considering a different approach. Instead of trying to make you disappear back into anonymity, they're thinking about using your platform more strategically." The new plan was ambitious. The White House Communications Agency wanted to create a documentary series about government employees whose work was essential but often invisible to the public. I would be the host and primary photographer, traveling to different agencies and departments to tell the stories of people whose dedication kept the country running. Think of it as dirty jobs for government service, Director Henley explained during our second video conference. You'd document the work that people never see, but that makes everything else possible. The project would take me to NOAA weather stations where meteorologists tracked hurricanes, to CDC laboratories where researchers developed vaccines, to National Park Service facilities where rangers protected wilderness areas. I'd photograph the people who maintained air traffic control systems, who processed immigration applications, who ensured food safety standards were met. The goal is to show Americans that government service isn't just about politicians and bureaucrats, Director Henley continued. It's about talented professionals who chose to use their skills for public benefit instead of private profit. Quote, "It was exactly the kind of work I dreamed of doing when I first became interested in photography, telling important stories about people whose contributions deserved recognition. But accepting the position would mean giving up any chance of returning to my quiet, anonymous life." "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course, but we need an answer by next week. If you're not interested, we'll need to find someone else to lead the project." That evening, I had dinner with my family for the first time since Jennifer's wedding. We met at a restaurant in Chinatown that my parents had been going to for 20 years, a place where the staff knew us well enough to treat us like regulars instead of the subjects of recent news coverage. The dynamic was completely different from any family gathering I could remember. Instead of deflecting questions about my work or defending my choices, I found myself actually being consulted about family decisions. "Sarah is thinking about switching her major to photojournalism," my mother said as we shared dim sum. "We wanted to get your opinion about whether that's a practical choice." 6 months ago, the same family members would have been pressuring Sarah to choose something more stable. Now they were asking me, the former family disappointment, for career advice. "What kind of stories does she want to tell?" I asked Sarah directly. "Environmental issues," she said, her voice gaining confidence as she talked. "Climate change, conservation efforts, the impact of policy decisions on local communities. I want to make complex issues accessible to people who might not otherwise pay attention." "That's exactly the kind of work the world needs," I told her. "And journalism schools are looking for students who understand both storytelling and social responsibility." I could see my parents processing this exchange. Their daughter was asking for advice about a creative career, and I was encouraging her instead of warning her about financial instability or lack of conventional success markers. "What about this documentary series?" my father asked. "Are you going to do it?" "I'm still deciding," I said. It would mean traveling constantly, being away from California most of the time. It would also mean staying in the public eye instead of going back to anonymity. Uncle Richard, who had been unusually quiet throughout dinner, finally spoke up. "Can I say something?" he asked, and waited for my nod before continuing. "I know I don't have the right to give you advice after how I treated you, but from a business perspective, this opportunity is incredible. You'd be building a national platform while doing meaningful work. That's rare." It was strange getting career advice from someone who had spent years telling me my career was a mistake. "What's your gut telling you?" Jennifer asked. She'd been following the media coverage closely and understood better than anyone how much my life had changed. "That I want to do work that matters," I said. "I've always wanted that. The question is whether I'm ready for everything that comes with it." "Like what?" "Like never being anonymous again. Like having every professional decision scrutinized by people who don't understand the work. Like having my personal life become part of the public conversation." My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Sweetheart," she said, "you've already proven that you can handle more than we ever gave you credit for. Maybe it's time to stop playing it safe." That night, I walked through my neighborhood thinking about the choice I had to make. 6 months ago, I'd been struggling to pay rent and wondering if I'd made a mistake by pursuing photography. 3 months ago, I'd gotten the opportunity of a lifetime, but had to keep it secret from everyone I cared about. A week ago, my secret had been exposed in the most dramatic way possible. Now I had the chance to build something even bigger, a platform to tell stories that needed telling, to shine light on work that deserved recognition, to show Americans a side of government service that most people never saw. The only question was whether I was brave enough to take it. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Whatever you decide about the documentary, thank you for showing me that it's okay to want something different than what other people expect." That's when I knew what my answer would be. I called Director Henley the next morning and accepted the documentary position. "Excellent," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Your first assignment starts next week. We're sending you to Yellowstone National Park to document the wildfire prevention team. Pack for cold weather and be prepared to hike." The transition from secret presidential photographer to documentary host happened faster than I'd expected. Within 2 weeks, I had a production team, a travel budget that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, and a schedule that would take me to government facilities across 34 states over the next year. The Yellowstone assignment turned out to be perfect preparation for what was to come. The wildfire prevention team was led by Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a forest ecologist who had spent 15 years developing early detection systems that could identify potential fire conditions weeks before they became dangerous. "Most people think we just wait for fires to start and then try to put them out," she explained as we hiked through a section of forest where her team had installed monitoring equipment. "But the real work happens long before the first spark. We're constantly analyzing soil moisture, wind patterns, vegetation density, and dozens of other factors to predict where problems might develop." Her team included meteorologists, botanists, computer scientists, and logistics specialists who worked together to protect millions of acres of wilderness. They were saving lives and preserving natural treasures, but most Americans had never heard of them. "The politicians get credit when we prevent disasters," Dr. Thompson said with a wry smile, "but prevention is invisible. Nobody throws parades for fires that never started." That became the central theme of the documentary series, the invisible expertise that kept the country running. Over the next 6 months, I documented air traffic controllers who managed thousands of flights daily without a single collision, FDA inspectors who prevented food poisoning outbreaks by catching contamination before it reached consumers, and Census Bureau statisticians whose data informed everything from disaster relief funding to congressional representation. Each episode followed the same basic structure: introduce the team, explain their mission, show them at work, and highlight a specific success story that demonstrated their impact. But what made the series compelling was the personal stories behind the professional expertise. In Denver, I met Marcus Williams, an air traffic controller who had prevented a mid-air collision by spotting an error in flight coordinates that 3 different computer systems had missed. He'd been working overtime that day because 2 colleagues were out sick, and his split-second decision had saved 847 lives. "My family still doesn't really understand what I do," he told me during our interview. "They know it has something to do with airplanes, but they think it's basically the same as working at the airport information desk." In Atlanta, I documented Dr. Lisa Patel, a CDC epidemiologist who had identified the source of a salmonella outbreak by tracing contaminated lettuce back to a specific farm in Arizona. Her investigation had prevented thousands of additional cases of food poisoning, but the public never learned her name. "Success in public health means nothing happens," she explained. "When we do our jobs well, diseases don't spread, outbreaks don't occur, and people stay healthy. But it's hard to get recognition for preventing something that most people never knew was a threat." The series launched 6 months after Jennifer's wedding, with an hour-long premiere episode that featured my own story alongside Dr. Thompson's wildfire prevention work. The parallel structure was intentional. 2 women whose expertise had been undervalued until dramatic events forced people to pay attention. The response exceeded everyone's expectations. The premiere episode drew 2.3 million viewers, making it the most-watched documentary in the network's history. More importantly, it sparked conversations about the value of public service and the expertise required for jobs that most people took for granted. But the real measure of success came from the messages I received from government employees who felt seen and appreciated for the first time in their careers. "I've been working for the National Weather Service for 12 years, wrote meteorologist Janet Rodriguez from Kansas. "My neighbors think I just read weather maps, but last month my tornado warning saved 37 lives in a mobile home park. Your documentary helped my family understand that my work actually matters." The series also had an unexpected impact on recruitment. Government agencies reported significant increases in applications from qualified candidates who had learned about career opportunities they'd never known existed. We've had more engineering graduates apply for positions with the Federal Aviation Administration in the past 3 months than in the previous 2 years combined, one HR director told me. Your documentary showed people that government work can be intellectually challenging and personally meaningful. Quote, 6 months into the documentary project, I was invited to speak at my old business school about alternative career paths. Standing in the same lecture hall, where professors had once emphasized the importance of maximizing personal financial gain, I talked about the satisfaction of using your skills for public benefit. Success doesn't always look like what you expect, I told the students. Sometimes it looks like preventing disasters that never happen, solving problems that never make headlines, or serving people who never know your name. But that doesn't make it less valuable. During the question and answer session, a student asked about the personal costs of choosing public service over private sector opportunities. Won't you always make less money working for the government, she asked. Probably, I admitted. But I've learned that there are different ways to measure wealth. I'm wealthy in purpose, in meaningful work, in the knowledge that my efforts contribute to something larger than myself. 6 months ago, my family thought I was failing because I wasn't maximizing my earning potential. Now they understand that success can be defined in many different ways. After the speaking engagement, I drove back to San Francisco thinking about how much had changed since that night in Jennifer's driveway. My family relationships had been transformed, my career had evolved in ways I could never have imagined, and I'd found a platform to tell stories that needed telling. But perhaps the most important change was internal. I'd stopped seeking validation from people who didn't understand my choices and started building a life based on my own values and priorities. My phone rang as I was crossing the Bay Bridge. It was Sarah, calling from UC Berkeley, where she was now studying photojournalism. I got an internship with National Geographic, she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. They want me to work on a series about climate change impacts in coastal communities. That's incredible, I said, and meant it. When do you start? This summer. And Sophia, I wanted to thank you, not just for encouraging me to pursue journalism, but for showing me that it's okay to choose work that matters to you, even when other people don't understand it. That evening, I had dinner with my parents at the same Chinatown restaurant where we'd discussed the documentary opportunity months earlier. But this time, the conversation was different. Instead of them asking about my career choices, I found myself asking about theirs. Do you ever regret not pursuing art? I asked my mother, who had studied painting before switching to accounting for practical reasons. She considered the question seriously before answering. I used to think I'd made the right choice because accounting provided security. But watching you build a career around your passion has made me wonder what might have been possible if I'd been braver. It's not too late, I said. You're only 56. You could take classes, join art groups, and start painting again as a serious hobby. Maybe I will, she said, and something in her voice suggested she was actually considering it. As I drove home that night, I realized that my story had become larger than just one person's career journey. It had become a catalyst for other people to reconsider their own relationships with work, success, and family expectations. The documentary series was renewed for a second season, with plans to expand internationally and explore how different countries supported public service careers. I would be traveling even more, telling even more stories, and continuing to build a platform that celebrated expertise and dedication wherever it was found. But the most satisfying part of my new life was this. I no longer felt like I had to prove my worth to anyone. The work spoke for itself, the stories I was telling mattered, and the people whose lives I was documenting felt valued and understood. 6 months ago, I'd been standing in a driveway feeling like a disappointment. Now I was building something that would outlast any single career or recognition. I was creating a legacy of stories that honored the quiet heroes who kept the world running, one documentary at a time. And sometimes, late at night when I was editing footage in hotel rooms across America, I would think about that moment when Marine One landed on the Blackwood Estates lawn and changed everything. Not because it made me famous, but because it forced everyone around me to confront their assumptions about what valuable work looked like. The helicopter had landed for 5 minutes, but the conversations it started were still continuing, rippling outward through families and communities and careers, one story at a time. 1 year later, I found myself back at the Blackwood estate. Jennifer had invited me to their first wedding anniversary celebration, a much smaller gathering than the original reception. As I walked up the same driveway where everything had changed, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The woman who had been asked to leave this place was now returning as the guest of honor. The anniversary party was intimate, maybe 30 people instead of 300. Jennifer and David looked relaxed and happy, in a way that the stress of their wedding day hadn't allowed. They'd spent the past year traveling, with David's tech company going fully remote and Jennifer launching her own marketing consultancy. "I have something to show you," Jennifer said as soon as I arrived, pulling out her phone with obvious excitement. On the screen was a news article with the headline, "Local Marketing Executive Launches Nonprofit to Support Government Employee Families." The photo showed Jennifer standing in front of a community center, surrounded by family members of federal workers. "I started this because of what happened at our wedding," she explained. "I realized how many families don't understand what their relatives do in government service. We provide educational workshops, family support groups, and resources to help people appreciate the importance of public sector work." The nonprofit had already helped over 200 families across Northern California. Jennifer showed me testimonials from spouses who finally understood their partner's dedication to public service, from parents who stopped pressuring their children to leave government jobs, from siblings who learned to respect career choices they'd previously dismissed. One woman wrote to thank us because her husband has been a forest ranger for 20 years, and she never understood why he was so passionate about it until she attended one of our workshops, Jennifer continued. Now she volunteers for conservation projects on weekends. It was exactly the kind of ripple effect that the documentary series had been creating across the country, but seeing it happen in my own family felt particularly meaningful. Uncle Richard approached us, looking somewhat sheepish. Over the past year, he'd become an unlikely advocate for government service, using his business connections to create internship programs that connected college students with federal agencies. "I wanted to update you on the internship program," he said, and I could hear genuine pride in his voice. "We've placed 43 students in government positions over the past 8 months. 3 of them have already received job offers." "That's incredible," I said, and meant it. "What inspired you to get involved?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "Honestly, guilt. I spent years dismissing the importance of public service, and I realized I needed to do something to make up for that attitude. These kids are brilliant. Computer science majors, engineering students, policy researchers. They could make more money in private industry, but they want to serve their country. They deserve support." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah, who had just returned from her National Geographic internship documenting rising sea levels in Miami. She looked confident and professional in a way that reminded me of myself a year earlier, someone who had found their calling and was pursuing it despite external pressures. "I have news," she announced to the group. "National Geographic offered me a full-time position as a staff photographer. I'll be based in Washington, D.C., working on environmental and policy stories." The celebration that followed was unlike any family gathering I could remember. Instead of questioning her choices or expressing concern about financial stability, everyone congratulated Sarah on finding meaningful work that aligned with her values. "When do you start?" my mother asked, already planning care packages and visits. "Next month," Sarah said, "and I'm terrified and excited in equal measure." "Good," I told her. "That usually means you're doing something worth doing." As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with David's parents, the same people who had looked at me with such disdain during the original wedding reception. The transformation in their attitude was remarkable. "We've been following your documentary series," David's mother said. "It's opened our eyes to how much we don't know about government work. Our neighbor's daughter works for the EPA, and we never understood what that meant until we watched your episode about environmental protection. She's actually doing fascinating research on water quality standards," David's father added. "We invited her family over for dinner last week, just to learn more about her work." These small conversations, multiplied across thousands of families, represented the real impact of the past year's work. The documentary series had reached over 15 million viewers across its first season, but more importantly, it had changed how people thought about public service careers. Later in the evening, President Harrison called to congratulate me on the documentary's success and to discuss plans for the international expansion. The conversation was brief but warm, and he mentioned something that stayed with me. "You know what I'm most proud of?" he said. "It's not just that you're telling these stories. It's that you're inspiring other people to see the heroism in everyday service. That's exactly what this country needs right now." After the call, I stepped outside onto the same lawn where Marine One had landed exactly 1 year earlier. The grass had long since recovered from the helicopter's impact, but the effects of that 5-minute visit were still rippling outward in ways no one could have predicted. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the wildfire prevention specialist from Yellowstone. "Sophia, our funding has just increased by 40%. Congressional representatives cited your documentary when they voted to expand our program. We can hire 12 new researchers and upgrade our monitoring equipment. Thank you for showing people what we do." Similar messages had been coming in regularly. The documentary series had led to increased funding for multiple government programs, improved recruitment for federal agencies, and a measurable shift in public opinion about the value of government service. But perhaps the most meaningful development was personal. My relationship with my family had evolved from tolerance to genuine respect and support. We'd moved beyond the superficial markers of success that had once divided us and learned to appreciate different definitions of achievement. As I prepared to leave the anniversary party, Jennifer pulled me aside one more time. "I need to tell you something," she said. "That night at our wedding, when we asked you to leave, it wasn't really about the other guests or making the right impression." I looked at her, waiting for the rest. "We were embarrassed because we didn't understand your choices, and that made us feel inadequate. It was easier to exclude you than to admit we might be wrong about what success looks like." It was the most honest thing anyone in my family had ever said to me about those years of dismissal and judgment. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. "But you know what? I'm glad it happened the way it did. If Marine One hadn't landed that night, none of us would have learned what we needed to learn." Driving home, I thought about the documentary crew I'd be meeting tomorrow to start filming the second season. We were planning episodes about NASA engineers, State Department translators, and National Archives preservationists. Each story would highlight expertise that kept the country functioning, work that deserved recognition but rarely received it. My phone rang as I reached my apartment. It was Agent Collins, calling with an update about the security situation that had dominated my life a year earlier. "The good news is that you're no longer considered a security risk," she said with obvious amusement. "The foreign intelligence services have moved on to other targets, and your public profile has actually made you safer rather than more vulnerable." "How is that possible?" "It turns out that being famous for taking pictures of forest rangers and air traffic controllers isn't particularly interesting to hostile governments. You're too visible now to be useful for espionage, and your work is too benign to reveal sensitive information." It was a perfect summary of how my life had changed. I'd gone from secret government photographer to public advocate for government service, from family disappointment to documentary host, from someone seeking validation to someone whose work validated itself. But the most important change was this. I'd learned that the approval I'd been seeking from my family was less important than the purpose I'd found in my work. The documentary series had given me a platform to celebrate people whose contributions mattered, even when those contributions went unnoticed. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about all the government employees I'd met over the past year. Scientists preventing disease outbreaks, engineers maintaining critical infrastructure, analysts protecting national security, educators serving underserved communities. Their work was essential, their expertise was remarkable, and their dedication was inspiring. Most of them would never have helicopters land on their families' lawns. They would never be featured in news stories or honored at public events. But their work would continue protecting lives, preserving resources, and serving the public good in ways that made everything else possible. That was the real story. Not the 5 minutes when Marine One descended from the sky, but the millions of hours that dedicated professionals spent doing work that mattered, whether anyone was watching or not. And now, thanks to the documentary series, more people are watching, more families were understanding, more young people were considering public service careers. The invisible heroes were becoming a little less invisible, one story at a time. 6 months from now, I'd be starting production on the international series, documenting public servants in 12 different countries. The work would continue expanding, reaching new audiences, celebrating different forms of service and expertise. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the chain of events that had led me here. A wedding invitation, a family's misplaced shame, a presidential helicopter, and the courage to accept opportunities that scared and excited me in equal measure. Sometimes the most important moments in your life happen in 5 minutes or less, but their impact can last forever, rippling outward through families and communities and careers, changing how people see themselves and each other. Marine One had landed and taken off in 5 minutes, but the conversations it started were still continuing, and they would keep going long after everyone had forgotten about the helicopter itself. That was the real power of recognition, not the moment when it happened, but everything that came after. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.